So let's talk about the basic structure and function of the other control system, our endocrine system. Okay. This was our wireless system, right? And the idea with the endocrine system is it's composed of a variety of endocrine glands. Okay? Some of those endocrine glands are called central endocrine glands because they're part of the central nervous system. Some of them are called peripheral because they're outside of the central nervous system. Okay? Some endocrine glands are dedicated endocrine glands, meaning that's their only function. And then many, many endocrine structures have mixed function, meaning they've got like a day job and their endocrine job is a side job. Okay? So that includes things like the kidney, because the kidney's day job is certainly urine production. Right? It's hard to argue that the kidneys have any other day job besides that. However, they also produce things like erythropoietin, which controls red blood cell production. Right? A hormone that acts on the bone marrow to control red blood cell production. It also includes organs like the heart, which clearly has a day job, but on top of that produces a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANF, which can increase the excretion of sodium when blood volume increases and the heart feels a stretch on its chambers. Okay? So there are structures in the body that have mixed endocrine and other function, and then there are dedicated endocrine structures. And the basic idea behind endocrine function is that the physiological effect that a hormone has on a target cell is very dependent on the receptor it binds to. Okay? And this is sort of the amazing thing about the endocrine system, that you can have one hormone released by one endocrine structure, and it can create a variety of effects in different parts of the body because it's binding to different receptors. It can have completely conflicting effects, right? So the hormone epinephrine that's released by our adrenal medulla can cause vasoconstriction of blood vessels leading to organs like the GI tract, and vasodilation of blood vessels that perfuse skeletal muscle. Right? Same hormone, completely opposite effects because they're binding to completely different receptors. Okay? So it's a very efficient system. So the physiological response is completely dependent on the interaction between the hormone and the receptor on the target cell. So hormones bind to receptors, and it creates different intracellular changes. Okay? And that intracellular change is what's going to bring about the response. So a hormone can bind to a receptor and change, it can open or close an ion channel. Okay? The reason why epinephrine can cause constriction and dilation is because on the cells where it causes constriction, it causes the opening of sodium channels. So sodium enters the cell, the muscle contracts, and the vessel constricts. Okay? And it causes dilation in the other ones because it binds to a receptor that opens potassium channels. Potassium moves out, hyperpolarizes the cell. The muscle relaxes, and the vessel dilates. Okay? So we can open or close an ion channel and create the response because of a change in membrane potential. We can act through a second messenger system to turn on or turn off a protein. And another way to say that is basically turn on or turn off an enzyme. Okay? So you can have insulin binding to a cell on the liver, binding to its receptor on the cell of the liver, right? That causes glucose to enter, and it also turns on the enzymes necessary to convert glucose into glycogen. Make sense? So the hormone can act through a second messenger system to turn off or turn on an enzyme to create an intracellular reaction. Okay? And second messenger systems are, it's a term to describe, the hormone is the first messenger, and the second messenger is some sort of intracellular messenger that the hormone triggers. Okay, and you'll see that in just a moment a little bit more clearly. And then lastly, another way that hormones act on target cells is to control the expression of genes. Okay? To control the expression of genes. So thyroid hormone, for example, binds to a variety of cells in the body, and it increases the metabolic rate of the cell. Well, one of the ways is that it increases the production of sodium-potassium ATP pumps. So the cell consumes more ATP. Okay? So controlling gene expression by the cell is another effect, intracellular effect, to create a response. Okay? There's a variety of hormones, and they differ in chemical structure, and they fall in certain categories. The vast majority of hormones in the body are protein or peptide in structure. Okay? So either they're usually short chains of amino acids, okay, and are sort of protein or peptide in chemical structure. Others are amino acid derived, meaning they're a single amino acid with a modification. Okay? And then there's the last category are steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are not protein-based at all. They're not amino acid-based at all. They are actually derived from cholesterol. Now, the meaningful difference between these different types of chemical types of hormones is basically whether a hormone is water-soluble or fat-soluble. Because whether a hormone is water-soluble or fat-soluble is going to determine a lot about how the hormone is synthesized, how it's stored, how it's transported in the bloodstream, and how it interacts with the target cell. Okay? So first, let me show you this. So here's a list of a variety of peptide hormones, right? Protein or peptide hormones. A variety of, thank you, a variety of amino acid-derived hormones, and then the list of steroid hormones. Now, all steroid hormones are fat-soluble. All steroid hormones are fat-soluble. And then T3 and T4, which stands for triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine, which is thyroid hormone. Okay? T3 and T4 are also, even though they are amino acid derived, they are also fat-soluble. So all the steroid hormones and thyroid hormone, the two forms of thyroid hormone, are fat-soluble. The rest are water-soluble. Okay? So water-soluble hormones differ in terms of these characteristics from fat-soluble hormones in important ways. So synthesis. With the exception of T3 and T4, the water-soluble hormones are protein in nature, and so they tend to be start off as long longer chains of amino acids that get pared down to an active hormone, while the fat-soluble hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. In terms of storage, water-soluble hormones are very easily stored in intracellular vesicles, and they often are. Okay? Most of the time they are. Can we store a fat-soluble hormone in an intracellular vesicle? No, because it'll float out, right? You can't put a fat-soluble hormone, keep it in a vesicle, because it freely diffuses across membranes. Okay? So if you want to store a hormone, a fat-soluble hormone, you either can't store it at all, you have to make it on demand, or you have to store it attached to something else that is water-soluble. Okay? And actually, the thyroid hormone, when we get to the thyroid hormone disorders, you'll see that that's exactly what we do. We make T3, we make T4, we attach it to a huge protein that can't get out of the gland, and then we just break the bond when we want to release it. Okay? Hormone transport. Our bloodstream, our plasma, is an aqueous solution, right? It's a water-based solution. So water-soluble hormones, no problem at all. They travel freely in plasma. Fat-soluble hormones, they need to be bound to a plasma protein. Okay? They need to bind to a plasma protein when they're in plasma, and they need to be unbound in order to act on their target cells. And as you'll see in a moment, there's two types of plasma proteins that really take care of this kind of hormone transport. And then interaction with target cell, water-soluble hormones must bind to some surface receptor. They can't cross the membrane freely, so their receptor has to be on the plasma membrane. And so they're going to either open or shut an ion channel or work through a second messenger system. While for fat-soluble hormones, they freely cross the plasma membrane, so they tend to have intracellular receptors, often within the nucleus, and in that case, they are controlling gene expression, the fat-soluble hormones. Okay? All right. This gets a lot easier when we get into the specific examples. Now, for protein binding, these fat-soluble hormones need to travel in the bloodstream bound to plasma proteins. And there are two types of plasma proteins that bind to hormones. And you can kind of think of this as you live in a city, okay? And in order to get from point A to point B, there's either a free public shuttle that can take anybody, or you're very special and you have a car service pick you up and take you to your destination, okay? Now, the same thing is true for the body and hormones. The general city public shuttle is albumin, okay? Now, albumin, has anybody ever been to like a developing country or a non-developed country and seen like public transportation, where like you just have people grabbing onto the bus and then jumping off, and you know, that's literally what albumin looks like, right? So it's traveling around, the hormones jump on, they jump off, right? And they have very low affinity for albumin, right? Because albumin is a very generic plasma protein. So all of these lipid-soluble structures, they have usually a very modest, low affinity for albumin binding, which is good because it sort of helps them travel in the bloodstream, but it doesn't keep them from being able to unbind to interact with their target cell. Okay? So albumin's like the dirty city bus, you know, that is completely free. You're not going to like it too much, but it'll get the job done. Now, the specific car service are these specific hormone binding proteins, okay? And the hormone's going to have a much higher affinity for this. And it's going to be very hormone specific. Now, almost all fat-soluble hormones have a specific hormone binding protein. And even some non-fat-soluble or water-soluble hormones have specific binding proteins. Okay? That's an important issue. Almost all fat-soluble hormones, in addition to being able to use albumin, are going to have a specific hormone binding protein. But even some water-soluble hormones are going to have a specific binding protein. Because the purpose of the specific binding protein is more than just transport. Okay? So it's going to, in addition to providing transport for the lipid-soluble hormones, it's also going to maintain a reservoir of that hormone in the bloodstream, right? And it creates this relatively stable concentration of the hormone in the bloodstream, and it prevents moment-to-moment fluctuations of that hormone level. Okay? Which is really important when you think about hormones whose actions are designed to be sort of prolonged and sustained and control kind of baseline functions. Okay. So thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone levels determine basal metabolic rate. Okay? So you clearly don't want your thyroid hormone level to undergo fluctuations because you don't want your basal metabolic rate to be going up and down. You want it to be a stable baseline. So thyroid hormone has thyroglobulin in the bloodstream that it binds to. It has a relatively high affinity for, so that the concentration of thyroid hormone in the bloodstream remains stable. Right? So only a certain percentage of thyroid hormone in the bloodstream is available at any time for binding, but the total amount stays pretty stable. Does that make sense? The same is true for growth hormone. Growth hormone is actually a water-soluble hormone, but it has a binding protein for the same reason. Okay? So the binding protein story involves albumin, which is purely for transport, and the specific binding proteins that is really much more about stable blood concentrations. And transport is just like a perk, a side effect of that. All right. When we talk about the magnitude or the physiological effect a hormone has on the body, we often say that it is proportional to the plasma concentration of that hormone. Okay. So the effect, either the magnitude of the effect or the net effect of the hormone, is really dependent on the plasma concentration of the hormone. It's actually the same general principle that you see in pharmacology, right? The effect of a drug on the body is proportional to the plasma concentration of the drug. If the plasma concentration is within a therapeutic range, you'll get the therapeutic effect. If it's below that therapeutic range, you won't get that effect. And if it's in a toxic range, then you're going to get a harmful effect. Okay. So hormones are sort of very similar in terms of those principles. Okay. So a hormone needs to be present at a particular concentration or range of concentrations in order to create its basic effects, right? In order to have its basic effect on the body, or the desired effect on the body. And when we talk about the concentration of hormone in circulation, What we're actually talking about is this little box right here. So this larger orange box that this box is in is the blood compartment, right, in plasma. And this little box is labeled free biologically active hormone. So the concentration of hormone that is so important to consider is the amount that is free, meaning unbound to any plasma proteins, and biologically active. Okay? So when we talk about T3 and T4 and thyroid hormone, there is a binding protein called thyroglobulin or thyroglobulin binding protein, whatever you want to call it, okay, that binds to T3 and T4. And between T3 and T4, T3 triiodothyronine is actually the biologically active form of the hormone. T4 is inactive and has an extra iodine that needs to come off of it in order to be active. Okay? So in terms of this little box, for thyroid hormone, what's relevant for its effects on the body, like basal metabolic rate, is the percentage of total thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, that is unbound at any moment in time and is in its T3 form. Okay? So the hormone has to be able to bind to its receptor, so it must be free and not bound, and it has to be in its biologically active form to be able to have its desired physiological effect. Okay? So this pool, the concentration of this free biologically active hormone, is a steady state, okay, that is determined by the rate of secretion, right, the rate of binding versus unbinding to the plasma proteins, if it does bind, and the rate of removal from the blood, either into the target cell or through elimination, either metabolism or just urinary excretion. Okay? So how much is free and biologically active in the blood is determined by the rate of secretion, right, the degree of binding, and the rate of removal from the blood. Which might sound quite similar to, again, pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, talk about absorption, right? Absorption, distribution, elimination, okay? So if you think of this is a bathtub of water, and the drain is on and the faucet is running, okay? The level of water in the bathtub is going to be proportional to how fast the water is moving into the tub, right? What's the water pressure, and how fast water is moving down the drain, okay? How fast is it coming out of the tub? And then that determines the actual concentration. So that's an important idea to hold on to. So there are hormones that are released in a constant way. So a given amount of this hormone is released in a constant way. Some hormones are released in what's called pulses, right? So there's a 5-minute period of time where there's a lot of release of hormone, followed by another 5-minute period of time where there's no release, followed by another period where there's more. Okay, so it's released in pulses. We'll look at it. We'll look at what that looks like. There are hormones that are released in a diurnal pattern, meaning in a 24-hour cycle. Okay, so released at night, not released during the day. Or released during the day and not released at night. Okay? So their levels, their concentration levels in the blood is determined by the rate of secretion, the timing of secretion, pattern of secretion and the rate of removal from the blood. Okay? So some examples of patterns of hormone release. Some hormones are released based on moment-to-moment needs of the body, like epinephrine is released from the adrenal medulla in times of stress, right? So in baseline levels, when you're not in a fight or flight response, your epinephrine levels should be fairly low, right? And they only go up under stress conditions. Other hormones regulate more baseline functions, and so they have a more predictable pattern of release. Okay? So some hormones, many hormones, are released in what's called a diurnal pattern, okay? Meaning according to your 24-hour biological clock. Now, anything that is controlled by that is controlled under a diurnal pattern is ultimately regulated and controlled by a tiny little part of the brain called the SCN, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay? And it's a fascinating little part of the brain because this part of the brain is spontaneously active around a 24-hour cycle. Okay? So 12 hours a day, it has a higher firing rate of action potentials than the subsequent 12 hours a day. Okay? So it has this spontaneous activity that is dependent on your 24-hour cycle. Okay? Now, the placement of this part of the brain, it's right above where your optic nerves, right, leading from the retinas of your eyes, where your optic nerves cross. Right? It's called the optic chiasm. That's why it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay? And it's placed there. Why would it be placed there? So you can get what kind of cues? So that part of the brain can get what kind of cues? Light cues. Okay? Because while it is spontaneously active around a 24-hour period, it's helpful to synchronize that period with day and night, right? And it does that by synchronizing it with light cues from the environment. If you spent a lot of time either very, very far north or very, very far south part of the world, where they have seasons of 24-hour light and 24-hour dark, right? Then what happens is your SCN sort of floats and it can't synchronize with anything. So you will be more awake 12 hours a day than the other 12 hours, but you have no idea what 12 hours it's going to be, okay? And the same thing happens with people who have a certain kind of blindness where no light comes in to their brain, when no light cues can come into their brain. They can't synchronize with day and light in the environment because they can't get that light cue coming in. So everything controlled by a diurnal rhythm is controlled by that part of the brain. And that includes the release of a variety of hormones. And one example of a hormone that's released in this pattern is cortisol. Cortisol, which we'll talk a little bit today, we'll talk quite a bit about it today. It's also mentioned, obviously, in the stress response lecture, because cortisol is a major hormone of the human stress response. Okay? Cortisol has a variety of actions, including things like increasing mental alertness, elevating blood glucose, okay? Doing a lot of things that enhance your ability to respond to stressful stimuli, or really any stimulating stimuli. So cortisol is released in greater amounts during the day than it is at night. Okay? So cortisol gets released. The peak cortisol levels actually happen just upon or before waking in the morning. Okay? And that peak of cortisol is actually part of what helps to transition you from sleep to wakefulness. Okay? It's one of several hormones and chemical messengers that enhance wakefulness at a predictable hour. Okay? And cortisol levels are lowest upon the end of the day, just before you go to sleep. Now, having this really nice diurnal pattern of cortisol that's really clean really is enhanced when you have a regular wake time and a regular sleep time. Okay? When someone goes to bed around the same time within an hour or so and wakes up around the same time within an hour or so, you get this really nice synchronization of these diurnal hormones that are especially linked to sleep. But when people do things like work, shift work, right, like work nights, your diurnal patterns get really, really screwy, right? As anybody here who's worked nights will tell you, right? You're either going to sleep for 2 hours or 14 hours, right? If you get sleepy, you're either dead for the rest of the week, or you can only sleep for like a short period of time. Your cortisol levels don't have that nice 12-hour. It gets a little bit messier. And the net effect when people work nights or shift work, where the shift is always changing, swing shift I think it's called, is that they tend to never truly feel fully awake, and they have a really hard time having really, really deep sleep. Right? So both periods of time get very screwy. So diurnal rhythm is an important rhythm for hormonal release. We also see hormones being released in pulses. This is another common pattern of hormonal release. So what we're looking at here is pulses of a hormone called luteinizing hormone. And this is a hormone that regulates reproductive function in both men and women. LH plays an important role in stimulating the production of estrogen and progesterone in females and testosterone in males. Okay. And this hormone, GnRH, we get into this more when we actually do endocrinology, but GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, is a hormone that stimulates the release of LH. So here what we have is on the bottom trace is electrical activity in the neuronal cells that release GnRH. Okay. So this black line is electrical activity in the cells that release GnRH. And up here, this is plasma concentration of LH. And of course, the x-axis is time. So up here, the LH, you notice there are blue dots, right? Blue dots. And then they've connected those blue dots with a black line. Those blue dots represent blood samples that are taken over this period of time. Each dot is a blood sample to assay for levels of LH. And then they've extrapolated this black line based on those values over time. So what you see is a wave of action potentials, right? A wave of depolarization in these GnRH releasing cells just before a wave of rise in LH in the blood. Okay? So these cells that release GnRH, that stimulates the release of LH, those cells fire a whole bunch of action potentials, release GnRH, and that stimulates a wave of increase in LH concentration. Okay? Now, if you count the number of pulses in a minute's worth of time or some unit of time. That gives you the frequency, right, the pulse frequency. And if you measure the plasma concentration from peak to trough, that tells you the pulse amplitude. Okay. So why release hormone like this? Why release hormone in pulses? So, go ahead. That is exactly why we do it. Okay? She said because so that the cell doesn't become desensitized to it. Pulsing a cell with hormone is necessary for certain hormones, okay, to maintain cell sensitivity to that hormone. Okay? So for many hormones, when they bind to their receptor, the receptors get internalized into the cell. Okay? And it takes a little time for that receptor to return to the surface. So if LH was a constant level, the cell's responsiveness would go down over time. Okay? Because it's in the middle of recycling the receptors at certain periods of time. Okay? So these pulses are used when you have hormones with receptors like this that get internalized in order to maintain cell sensitivity. Okay. So another hormone that's released like this is oxytocin, especially during labor. Right? So a woman is in labor, and with every wave of contraction, she gets a wave of oxytocin release. And oxytocin then binds to the receptors on the muscle in her uterus and causes lots of contraction, right? Now, those waves of oxytocin help maintain the uterus in a responsive state, and it also gives the uterus a little bit of a time to recover from each contraction. Okay. So introduce now the use of Pitocin, right, synthetic oxytocin during labor, that is not given in waves. It is given in an IV drip, right? So there is a certain if you give too much Pitocin, you can actually saturate the receptors, and all of a sudden the uterus can no longer respond. So this is an important concept for understanding how the body releases certain hormones and how then drugs that use those receptors need to be administered in order to mimic that pattern, right? Or at least considerations that need to be used. Okay? So I knew an obstetrician that. So Pitocin can also be used after the baby is delivered to reduce blood loss, because it constricts the muscles in the uterus and clamps down on the blood vessels after the placenta has detached. So I knew in OB that if a woman was at higher risk for postpartum hemorrhage, right, and there's certain categories that make you at higher risk, she would be very conservative about using Pitocin during the labor. She would actually not want to use Pitocin at all during the labor, because she didn't want to risk saturating the receptors and then all of a sudden the Pitocin's not effective, you know, to stop the bleeding afterwards. Okay? So this pulsatile release is really important for maintaining that cell sensitivity. Okay, so endocrine organs, endocrine glands, can be described as being central or peripheral. That's one category or categorization. And central endocrine disorders are called central because they are literally part of the central nervous system. Okay? So central endocrine glands are part of the central nervous system. Okay? peripheral glands are in the periphery. They're not part of the central nervous system. And often they are not part of the nervous system at all. Okay? So several structures, several central endocrine glands are of particular interest for understanding normal physiology and development of many diseases. And two of those structures include the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus, that sits at the base of the brain. Okay? It's a neuronal structure. It's composed of neuronal cells. But many of these neuronal cells are called neurosecretory cells because they synthesize and release hormone. And the hypothalamus is connected to another gland called the pituitary gland. Right? There's this tiny little connecting stalk that attaches it to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland sits in this bony encasement, right, to protect it. And there are two portions of the pituitary gland, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. This posterior lobe is greatly exaggerated in this picture. Right? The majority of the mass of the pituitary is in the anterior lobe. And the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is very different between anterior and posterior. Okay? Now, between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, what's the nature of that connection? Posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus. Okay? It's a neurological extension of the hypothalamus. There are actually no glandular secretory cells within the posterior pituitary. The neurosecretory cells that originate in the hypothalamus, their axons run through the connecting stalk, and their axon terminals are located within the posterior pituitary. And there's two hormones that the hypothalamus releases from the posterior pituitary. And that's vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone, same hormone, two names, okay, and oxytocin. Now, they are released from the posterior pituitary, but they are produced and controlled. Their release is controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay? Vasopressin and ADH we will talk about a lot in the renal system. It is important in water balance, right? Controlling the retention or excretion of water. And also, it's a vasoconstrictor. And then oxytocin plays an important role, as I mentioned, during labor. It also plays an important role in breastfeeding. And then oxytocin is thought to have a variety of very interesting roles in the brain, including mediating things like social bonding, okay, parental bonding. Of course, my husband sent me this article. He is a bigger science nerd than I am, so that tells you something. He sent me this article about, they studied men and oxytocin levels with age, especially oxytocin levels in the brain with age, and it tends to go up. Your oxytocin levels will also increase when you transition from if you were married, if you transition from pre-kids to after kids, your oxytocin levels go up. And they found that men with the highest oxytocin levels tended to be those that were the most fidelitous, so least amount of infidelity. So what is that? What's that? Faithful, thank you, yes. Fidelitous. Yes, faithful, thank you. Yes. So, and then men with on the lower end of the oxytocin scale tended to wander a bit. So it was very, very interesting. And like the tagline for him was like, "My oxytocin level is through the roof," you know. So we have a good marriage. It's nerd plus nerd. All right. So that is the relationship between hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. Relationship between hypothalamus and anterior pituitary is literally the communication between two endocrine glands. Okay? So the hypothalamus releases hormone that actually act on cells in the anterior pituitary to trigger or regulate the release of other hormones. So the GnRH-LH that I talked about earlier, GnRH is released from the hypothalamus and acts on LH-releasing cells in the anterior pituitary to stimulate the release of LH. And there are several anterior pituitary hormones that are controlled in this axis, right? This hypothalamic anterior axis, anterior pituitary axis. It includes LH, FSH. You don't have to worry about this list, but LH, FSH, prolactin, right? ACTH, TSH. Okay, so a whole host of hormones released from the anterior pituitary is controlled by hypothalamic hormones. Now, this connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is two parts of actually three, or two glands of actually three different endocrine glands that control hormone release. So in this particular axis, we've got endocrine gland number 1, in this case is the hypothalamus, releasing some hormone 1, acting on gland 2, which is anterior pituitary, releasing some second hormone. And then all of them have third endocrine gland in the body that triggers the release of a third hormone. And normally it's this hormone, this third hormone, that actually acts on target tissue to bring about the physiological responses. So in the thyroid hormone example, which we'll actually see a little bit more closely in a moment, the hypothalamic hormone is called TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone. That acts on the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which then acts on the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. Okay. TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone. The second hormone was TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and the third is T3 and T4. Okay. Now, all of those hormones I mentioned earlier, released from the anterior pituitary, participate in their own axis like this. Okay. Now, this is an example. It is a negative feedback loop, okay, because hormone number 3 and hormone number 2, for that matter, provides negative feedback to the glands above it to ultimately control the levels of hormone 3. Okay. And this kind of negative feedback is called the hierarchical level of control. Right? So there's a hierarchy of glands and of hormones, and then there's feedback within the hierarchy. Okay. And the advantage of this is, by having 2 points of control instead of just 1, you actually create better overall control of hormone 3 than you would otherwise. It's just better control because you have 2 points of control rather than just 1. example, we look at the thyroid gland. Okay? So the thyroid gland is this gland that has two lobes and a little connection, sits on the trachea, okay, at the bottom, sort of near the clavicles. And the thyroid gland is that third endocrine gland, right? So you've got the hypothalamus releasing TRH, acting on the anterior pituitary to release TSH, and that acts on the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. And T3 and T4 provides negative feedback at the level of both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Okay. Now, T3 and T4 is released in both a constant way and also in a diurnal pattern. And it controls baseline metabolic rate, baseline heat production. It has some enhancement of growth, especially of the central nervous system, right? Enhances sympathetic activity, right? It has a wide variety of effects, but the most notable effects is in elevation of energy consumption and metabolic rate. Okay. Now, we will talk actually quite a bit about thyroid disorders in the next part 2 of this class. But just to illustrate sort of the dynamics of the negative feedback with these hormones, if you have a problem with the anterior pituitary, if there is, for example, the TSH producing cells are non-responsive, okay? And they're non-responsive to TRH. So that means the hypothalamus would release TRH, the anterior pituitary would be non-responsive, and would not release TSH. And what would that do to T3 and T4 levels? It would decrease. So when you looked at these 3 hormones, what you would see is low T3 and T4, low TSH, and then what would TRH look like? It would be, what would it be, normal, low, or high? High, because of a lack of negative feedback. Okay? So looking at the levels of these 3 hormones actually tells you actually where is the problem, if any of the values are abnormal. Okay? So if I told you that TRH was high, TSH is high, T3 and T4 is low, where is the problem? At what level? The thyroid gland, right? Because TRH is high, TSH is high, T3 and T4 is low. This is the first inappropriate response. High TSH should produce high T3 and T4, but it's not. And then the lack of negative feedback creates an elevation of TRH and TSH. Okay. So these hierarchical control loops are very important to understand, and it applies to a variety of hormones released in this pattern and creates predictable problems. Yes?
But the production of TSH doesn't cause its own feedback loop to bring the TRH back to normal levels in that situation, does it?
No, because so the question is that the TSH feedback, does it sort of correct it to bring TRH back down? The most important signal is the third hormone signal. So the direction that this hormone goes is going to have the greatest influence on what the preceding hormones do. Okay. So another peripheral gland that's of great importance to us, even before we do endocrinology next semester, is the adrenal gland. And now the adrenal gland looks like this little blob of a structure that sits on top of each kidney. Okay? And if you look at the interior of this gland, which is what this is sort of sliced open, what you see is the interior, right, this yellow part, is called the adrenal medulla. And the layers outside of that are called the cortex. And these are essentially two very different endocrine glands. Okay? So the adrenal medulla is actually part of the sympathetic nervous system. And it releases epinephrine, a little bit of norepinephrine, right? If you're British leaning, adrenaline, noradrenaline, okay? So it's part of the sympathetic nervous system and controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex is an endocrine gland that produces steroid hormone. The adrenal cortex is an endocrine gland that produces steroid hormones. Okay? And the production of those steroid hormones are controlled by other hormones, right, interacting with the cortex. So this is the variety of steroid hormones produced by the adrenal cortex. There's 3 different layers of the adrenal cortex. Different layers produce different things. Now, all steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol, that guy up there. Okay? Now, starting from cholesterol, you can produce the various end hormones based on what enzymes these intermediates come in contact with. Okay? So if you look at the hormones that the adrenal cortex produces, there's 3 categories of hormones. Glucocorticoids. Okay? Glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids include this blue box: corticosterone, cortisol, cortisone. Right? These are stress hormones, and the reason why they're called glucocorticoids, because one of their many actions is they elevate blood glucose. Okay? So blue box: corticosterone, cortisol, cortisone. Second category, mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoid, which there's one, and it's this pink box, okay, called aldosterone. Okay. Mineralocorticoid, it's called mineralocorticoid because of its effect on sodium and potassium. It tends to cause retention of sodium and potassium loss. So mineralocorticoid, glucocorticoids. The last category are the sex hormones. Okay? Are the sex hormones. And it includes progesterone, different forms of estrogen, which is not in this slide, and the masculinizing hormones as well. Testosterone, DHEA. There's some different forms of masculinizing hormones. So feminizing hormones and masculinizing hormones, the sex hormones. Okay. These sex hormones, both categories, produced men and women by the adrenal cortex. Yeah, so starting from cholesterol, starting from cholesterol, the first thing to be produced is something called pregnenolone, and that's a common precursor to all of them. And if you notice that each of these molecules are moving through a bar, either across or below it, that bar is an enzyme. Right? So if pregnenolone moves across, it can produce progesterone, and if it continues to move across, it can produce a glucocorticoid. Or it can move ultimately across and produce aldosterone. Or it can move down and produce one of the masculinizing hormones, one of the androgens. Okay. So it's kind of the part of these steroid hormones is that really everything is derived from everything else. And while all the intermediates are lipid soluble and move freely from layer to layer, the enzymes are proteins and they are only located in certain cells, right? But the consequence of how closely related these structures are, one of the consequences are, for example, the glucocorticoids are not actually all that different in structure from the mineral corticoid. So what you find is that these forms of cortisol have mild mineral corticoid actions. So these forms of cholesterol produce a certain amount of sodium retention and potassium loss. Right? So because they're so structurally different, so structurally similar, you can end up with a little bit of crossover of effects. Okay. Aldosterone, we talked about in the renal system. The masculinizing and feminizing hormones, we talk about a little bit in some of the pathological endocrine disorders. And if you have maternal fetal newborn physiology with me this summer, we talk a lot about that. So let's look a little bit more about cortisol. Okay? Now, I tend to only refer to it as cortisol, but all three of those glucocorticoids are really of equal potency. So corticosterone, cortisol, and cortisone, thank you. I answered that question. All right. They are all sort of, the production of all three of those are controlled in the same way. I just sort of shorthand it and refer to them all as cortisol. Okay. Now, cortisol, the production of cortisol is controlled again by one of these hypothalamic pituitary connections. So the hypothalamus releases a hormone called CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which acts on the adrenal cortex to increase production of cortisol. Okay? And then cortisol provides negative feedback at the level of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary again. Now, I told you earlier, cortisol is produced in a diurnal pattern, right? Its levels reach their peak just upon waking or just before waking and reach their lowest point right before going to bed or right before sleeping. However, you get a release of cortisol under stress-related conditions. It's part of the human stress response. So in addition to maintaining some baseline functions, an increase in cortisol also produces some acute effects. So what are the effects of cortisol? Cortisol acts on a lot of target organs to do a variety of things. Now, up here, if you notice, there's a picture of the liver. And cortisol is a glucocorticoid, so it's called that because of its ability to elevate blood glucose. And it actually does that in a variety of ways, including stimulating the liver to break down stores of glycogen and also to increase its production of new glucose called gluconeogenesis from things like circulating amino acids. Okay? So it increases the liver production of glucose. Cortisol also acts on skeletal muscle. It tends to actually break down skeletal muscle in order to release amino acids. And where do you think those amino acids are going to go to? To the liver to help produce more glucose. Okay? Now, keep this in mind. Cortisol-related reactions are designed to be short-lived stress responses. Okay? You're not supposed to have persistent release of cortisol, although some people do, right? And that's a pathological thing. But a short-lived release of cortisol only produces a small amount of muscle breakdown and a boost of glucose. Pathologically high cortisol levels for a prolonged period causes muscle wasting and hyperglycemia. Okay? So these are all, think about this both in the short-lived, intended scale and also at the larger, more pathological scale. Cortisol also acts on bone, and it causes the breakdown of bone and the releasing of calcium into the bloodstream. Okay. Now, still on the topic of glucose, sorry, I talked about the bone thing too early. Still on the topic of glucose, glucose also it also acts on cells that are sensitive to insulin, and it antagonizes those receptors a little bit. Okay, so cortisol antagonizes the insulin receptors a little bit, and that reduces that insulin-mediated uptake of glucose. And it's keeping glucose in the blood. And the reason why it's keeping glucose in the blood is because there's one part of our body that can really only use glucose for energy, while other tissue can use glucose or fat. And what do you think that structure is that can only use glucose for energy? That's right, the brain. Okay, so it's preserving glucose for the brain. You need to think on your toes. You need to decide, is it worth fighting or should I just turn around and run? Okay? This is a stress response. Now, cortisol also, I'm skipping a few things, so just trust me why I'm skipping them. It also has some mild mineralocorticoid action, so it does produce a certain degree of sodium retention and potassium loss. Okay? And that's also good, right? We're getting more calcium in the body, we're getting more sodium in the body, because calcium and sodium are necessary for muscle contraction. Right? If we're going to fight or flee, we got to use a lot of muscle contraction. It also enhances the excitability of the brain. It increases mental agility. Okay? Allows you to be able to think fast, think clearly. Of course, too much cortisol, thinking goes out the window, right? And if you've ever stayed up all night and stressed over a test and tried to then go in and take that test, you know what that's about, okay? And then cortisol also is a potent anti-inflammatory hormone. It has potent anti-inflammatory effects and somewhat immune suppressive effects. And when I did the immune system, I actually talked about how steroids, cortisol, blocks the production of arachidonic acid, which is necessary to produce, don't worry about this, but necessary to produce prostaglandins and leukotrienes, which are part of inflammation, right? So that's how the cortisol blocks inflammation. And like I said, it also has some immunosuppressive effects. And the idea, again, is that you don't want, this is a time where you're shuttling all of your energy to respond to this stressor. Okay? You don't want to dedicate any energy at this time to your immune function. You can take a break from that for a little while. Okay? So those are the effects that cortisol have on the body.